Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of Denkfest. I'm really delighted to be here, and yet one more English accent for the wonderful translators to deal with. I've been very impressed, and I do want to thank them for all of their efforts on the behalf of those of us who don't speak English or German, whichever is the case. Thank you, translators, very much. Now, the topic of creationism and evolution has many aspects, and today I want to talk about why the various forms of creationism are not scientific, which many of you, of course, already know, but many of you, fellow skeptics, are concerned about how to convince others or communicate with others, and perhaps it might be useful to have a summary of some of the major reasons in case you are ever confronted with this issue. Of course, the United States is unusual among developed countries because of its high percentage of citizens who reject the idea of evolution. This is a study that was published in 2006. It has been widely cited around the world from Science magazine. The question that Miller and his colleagues asked was, humans evolved from earlier forms of animals, true or false? And the blue represents true, the red false, and the yellow is not sure. And the United States, among all of these countries, we beat Turkey. One of the most famous examples of American anti-evolutionism is the Scopes trial of 1925, when a teacher was put on trial for violating a Tennessee state law forbidding the teaching of human evolution. Scopes was convicted, and although his lawyers intended to appeal the conviction and thus test the law itself in court, because of a technicality they were unable to, and the Tennessee anti-evolution law, plus those of 3 other states, remained on the books from the 1920s until the late 1960s. Such laws were eventually struck down because of the American Constitution's Bill of Rights. There are 2 clauses involving religion in the Bill of Rights, the Establishment and Free Exercise clauses. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Together, they mean that public institutions must be religiously neutral. The state cannot promote nor inhibit religion, which is different from most of Europe, where you often have state religions and/or state support of religion. The courts have been pretty consistent that schools cannot advocate religion. Creationism is religion, hence it cannot be advocated. Now, obviously, you can talk about religion or talk about creationism as social phenomena. You can describe religion. The distinction here is, given our laws, you cannot advocate or inhibit. You cannot promote nor denigrate religion. In 1968, the Supreme Court decided in the case Epperson versus Arkansas that the state of Arkansas could not ban the teaching of evolution. The reason? Because the Arkansas anti-evolution law promoted a particular kind of Christianity, and the Establishment Clause requires the government to be religiously neutral. Anti-evolutionists were frustrated, but had already begun to build a movement that they felt would help their cause. Their cause, of course, is protecting children from learning about evolution, or at least not accepting that it is valid science. Conservative Christians hold that the Bible is the Word of God and is without error. Genesis must thus be interpreted literally, with creation taking place in 6 24-hour days. The Bible's parts are also closely connected. As in this cartoon, the whole Bible has to be viewed as a seamless web, and if Genesis isn't true, the whole thing unravels. A conservative Christian minister once said to me, if Genesis isn't true, how do I know that Revelations is true? So therefore, salvation is based in his theology upon the literal truth of Genesis. Genesis is in fact viewed as the source of all morality and goodness. Evolution, because it is not compatible with their interpretation of Genesis, is therefore the source of all that is bad or evil. So children must be protected against learning evolution lest they abandon their faith. You see here, creation is the source of laws, marriage, standards, and the meaning of life. Evolution is the source of lawlessness, homosexuality, pornography, abortion, many other social evils, according to these folks. 2 things happen when children cease to believe in God, according to this view. 1, they lose their moral compass. "If you teach a child they come from an animal, they will act like an animal," said one famous creationist. The second result is even worse. A child will be lost to salvation and not go to heaven. So conservative Christians are highly motivated to protect children from evolution, which they consider a highly toxic set of ideas. When courts determined that evolution could not be banned, creationists hit upon teaching an alternative to evolution that would moderate the feared evil effects of evolution. This was creation science. Henry M. Morris revived some ideas presented earlier by a Seventh-day Adventist creationist, such as flood geology, the notion that all of the sedimentary formations of the earth are the result of Noah's flood, and contended that they deserved a place in the classroom along with evolution. His claim was not only that the Bible is historically correct, this is why it is creation science, that scientific evidence demonstrates it. Needless to say, this is a difficult case to make. The fact claims of creation science proponents have been repeatedly shown to be invalid. They are special creationists, believing that God specially created living things and the whole universe in essentially their present form. This is, of course, incompatible with evolution, which sees the universe as having a history and of living things as sharing common ancestors. The common ancestry is why evolutionists look at life as forming a tree, produced by a genetic relationship among living things. Creationists look at living things as being separately created, a lawn, if you will, where each blade is separate and unrelated. More sophisticated creationists talk about the creationist orchard, where there is a separate creation of major groups, but evolution within the created kinds. So there would be a created cat kind, in which you would have the evolution within the created cat kind of cats and lions and house cats and leopards and all the various groups. Kinds seem to reflect something like the Linnaean concept of a family, but this varies also. Whether lawns or orchards, the explanation is separate creation for the various kinds of animals and plants as described in the literal interpretation of Genesis. This is a flyer from the creation science supporters promoting the idea that Earth is only a few thousands of years old instead of billions, and several other anti-evolution notions, such as the possibility of human and dinosaur footprints being found together. Let me just turn this around so that you can see it, because it's hard to read otherwise. There you go. Human and dinosaur footprints found together in Texas. It's always Texas. This would indeed be difficult for evolution to explain, but the footprints, as well as other creationist claims, are groundless. Now, just being wrong doesn't mean you aren't scientific. History is full of scientific ideas that were wrong. Lamarck's explanation of heredity was wrong, but it was perfectly scientific. There was nothing wrong with it in terms of science. The bitter truth, as any scientist will tell you, is that most of the explanations we come up with are wrong, but that doesn't mean they are unscientific. We don't reject creation science only because its claims are wrong. We reject it as not being scientific, and I'll get back to that, but let me continue with my brief history of creationism, and then I will return to why creationism isn't scientific. Eventually, creation science was also struck down in the courts, with the Supreme Court in Edwards versus Aguilar declaring that calling creationism science didn't make it non-religious, and by endorsing religion, an equal time for creation science law passed in Louisiana was unconstitutional. The act impermissibly endorses religion by advancing the religious belief that a supernatural being created humankind. Seeing that creation science was unlikely to be upheld as legal to teach, anti-evolutionists constructed a successor based on the design argument originally proposed in its best-known form by the English cleric William Paley. Paley wrote a very influential book in 1802 proposing that a proof of God's existence could be found in the complexities of nature. His analogy was that finding a rock on a heath would not be out of the ordinary. It might have been there forever. It was a natural object. But finding a pocket watch on the heath would be exceptional, since something so complicated as a watch would not be expected to have arrived there naturally. Something with as many integrated parts as a watch would not have come together by chance, hence there had to be a watchmaker. Therefore, if you saw something with a lot of integrated parts, like an eye, you would be justified in concluding that there was an eye maker, in other words, a god. This is the argument that was so ably discussed and demolished in Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. If we look at the modern intelligent design movement, which is based upon this idea of structural complexity not being natural, there really are only two scientific ideas, and one of them is actually a subset of the other. Michael Behe's idea of irreducible complexity is a way of saying, as Paley did, that very complicated biological phenomena can't be explained by natural causes and must therefore be explained by the actions of an intelligent agent. Intelligent agent is a fancy way of saying God. William Dembski's design inference, or specified complexity, is essentially the same idea, only instead of looking at complexity, Dembski stresses improbability. So the design inference is that very improbable phenomena require an intelligent agent. Intelligent agent is a fancy way of saying God. The good news is that the American legal system determined that intelligent design is also a fundamentally religious idea and that teaching it would violate the Establishment Clause. The case concerned a school board in Dover, Pennsylvania, and was decided in 2005. The headline, "Intelligent Design is Religious," judge says. The gray-haired lady in the corner is looking very pleased for a good reason. Kitzmiller versus Dover was an important case, not only for the National Center for Science Education. Full disclosure here, we were advisors to the legal team, but also for science education in the United States. Many school districts and state legislatures were poised to introduce ID policies if the judge had ruled that intelligent design was legal to teach. Fortunately, he did not. May I add, he was also a conservative Republican churchgoer. So what's the relationship between ID and creation science? ID is a subset of creation science. All of the ideas expressed in ID pre-existed in creation science. Although there are many claims made in creation science that are not found in ID, such as flood geology or age of the earth arguments. One big difference between creation science and ID is that creation science makes many more fact claims than ID, and as a result has a longer list of reasons why it is wrong. But although ID makes fewer fact claims, when it does make a fact claim, such as the irreducible complexity of the bacteria flagellum, it can also be shown to be wrong. That actually was a rather inspired strategy of the intelligent design supporters to make as few fact claims as possible and focus only upon the issue of the complexity of life and the improbability that highly complex structures, either biological or cosmological, could be produced through natural causes. It's essentially a philosophy of science argument more so than a fact claim argument. The talk is entitled, "Why Creationism Is Not Science," and in the interest in truth in advertising, I should tell you why I think this is so. Earlier, I mentioned that merely being wrong isn't enough. There's plenty of good science that turns out to be wrong or incomplete. So we do reject creation science and ID because they are wrong, but mostly because they don't measure up to the standards we set for the practice of good science. One characteristic of science is that it changes with new data and theoretical developments. It is not dogmatic. This is nicely illustrated by a comment I found in a newspaper article about some new fossils that seemed to challenge an interpretation of evolution supported by a paleontologist named Doug Irwin. "I hope they're right," Dr. Irwin said of the new findings, "because life will be more interesting for the next 10 or 20 years if they are. We'll have to re-examine a lot of assumptions." The principle illustrated here is that a scientific explanation is always open to revision, and that's okay. A similar sentiment was uttered by a friend when asked, "Why did you become a scientist?" "As an adolescent, I aspired to lasting fame. I craved factual certainty, and I thirsted for a meaningful vision of human life, so I became a scientist." This is like becoming an archbishop so you can meet girls. One does not become a scientist for factual certainty. A legal decision regarding creation science got it exactly right about this aspect of philosophy of science. The creationist methods do not take data, weigh it against the opposing scientific data, and thereafter reach the conclusion stated in the law. Instead, they take the book of Genesis and attempt to find scientific support for it. And also from McLean, someone cannot properly describe the methodology used as scientific if they start with a conclusion and refuse to change it, regardless of the evidence developed during the course of the investigation. Ignoring disconfirming evidence places you outside of the realm of science. That is the heart of understanding the tentativeness of science. Now, there are creationists who occasionally act like real scientists in this regard, so let us give credit where credit is due. Recall that creation science proponents believe that Noah's flood is a real historical event. Creationists, including the late David Fassold, have sought to find evidence of Noah's Ark. Fassold believed this impression in Turkey was the site where the Ark had landed. He eventually became convinced, though, that this site was a syncline, a normal geological feature. Unfortunately, most of the time, creation science proponents ignore disconfirming data or explain them with transparently weak arguments. Another problem with the science of creationism is in the logic used by both creation science and ID proponents. In creation science, you find what they call the two-model approach. Disprove evolution and special creation wins by default. This logic, if not A then B, is valid only if there are only two alternatives. And clearly there are many alternatives on the creationism side other than special creation. Disproving evolution does not, for example, disprove theistic evolution, nor any of the other world religions, nor the thousands of tribal religions or the ancient religions that no longer exist. So the logic is simply flawed. You cannot prove a creationist view by disproving evolution. This is actually an obvious point when it's pointed out, but if you look at the creationist literature, this is precisely what you find. It is attacks upon evolution with the assumption that if you can only disprove evolution, then their particular creationist version is proven. Similarly, intelligent design suffers from a logic regarding causation. Schematically, intelligent design proponents claim that irreducible complexity or specified complexity in Dembski's terms could be produced by chance, by natural selection, or intelligent design. Now, clearly chance is absurd. You can't get something like an eye out of chance. Everyone agrees with that. ID proponents also say that natural selection cannot produce specified complexity. Therefore, intelligent design wins. Now, most scientists conclude that natural selection can, in fact, explain complex phenomena and that intelligent design doesn't explain anything at all. But even if natural selection couldn't explain complexity when the other, even if natural selection couldn't explain complex structures, there is a further logical problem. Intelligent design is considered the explanation when two other causes are eliminated, but what if those aren't the only causes? How many of you here are scientists, just for fun? A bunch of hands went up. How many of you scientists think that we have discovered all the causative factors in the world? No hands are up, sure. Of course, there may always be unknown causes for the phenomena we are trying to explain. So, once again, the concern with intelligent design is with eliminating the possibility of natural cause, eliminating alternatives, and then winning by default. This is just what we saw in the two-model approach with creation science, where disproving evolution proved special creation, only in this case, disproving evolution proves intelligent design. The logic wasn't any better when it was originally proposed. Now, there are many more problems that creationism has as science, but my time is limited, so let me move to perhaps the most important reason, which is the reliance upon supernatural rather than natural explanations. This is especially relevant to the intelligent design position. Allow me a moment to talk about the nature of science so that we are on the same page regarding definitions. Science can be defined as a method for explaining the natural world using natural processes. And we also use science to describe the body of knowledge generated from this method. But I want to talk about the method. How do we generate this knowledge? Philosophers of science and scientists can debate these questions for years, but I'm pretty sure that all of them would agree that the most critical aspect of science is testing explanations. Now, there are many kinds of research design, but all agree with the big idea that explanations have to be tested against the natural world. There's direct and indirect experimentation, there are observational designs, there's statistical control of variables, there are lots of different ways that you can test an explanation, other than sitting in the laboratory pouring things from one beaker to another. But all of the tests of an explanation require the holding constant of certain variables so that the effect on other variables can be examined or tested. Now, viewed in this way, with testing of explanations being the most important aspect of a scientific method, science has two limitations. Science is limited to explaining the natural world, and it is limited to using natural processes. The reason for this is because the natural world is the only world in which we can control variables, in which we can hold constant variables. Natural processes, similarly, are the only kinds of processes that we can hold constant, the important criterion for testing. If there is a supernatural, by definition, we cannot hold it constant. Yeah. Elves and fairies, please stay out of my beaker. No, it doesn't work that way. This leads us to a couple of other words that we need to agree on the definition: materialism or naturalism. In the English-speaking world, we use these terms in two ways. We speak of methodological naturalism, which is what I just defined, the idea of using natural causes and restricting oneself to natural causes in the process of science as a methodology. There is also philosophical or ontological materialism. This is a philosophy or an ideology that says that only natural causes, only matter and energy exist in the universe, that there are no supernatural entities, only matter and energy. Now, it's important to realize that methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism are not the same. One is an ideology, one is a method by which all scientists, regardless of their ideology, operate when they are wearing their scientist hat, if you will. Where are we here? Let's go. There we go. Creationists fail the test of science because ultimately they have to resort to supernatural explanations. They reject methodological naturalism as being at the heart of science, and supernatural explanations, whether true or false, are outside of science. In the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial, both the ID and anti-ID supporters agreed that the way we practice science today, methodological naturalism is the key to science. The ID supporters contended in the trial and also in their literature that the definition of science should be expanded to include the occasional supernatural intervention. But of course, that would completely destroy any possibility of the accurate testing of ideas. How do you hold constant supernatural forces? So creationism as science has properly been rejected. Its factual claims have been shown to be wrong, and its underlying logic and approach to science have also been found wanting. Now, I would like to say a word or two more about the nature of science, because stimulated actually by the panel the first evening, and also other conversations held during this most interesting conference, because my comments will address this issue of creationism, science, and religion. Now, analogy. Visualize a garden. Now, the flowers are in competition with one another. They're in competition for water, for sunlight, for nutrients, and so forth and so on. If this is an ideological garden, we can look at the flowers as representing ideologies. Some of them are religious or theistic ideologies or worldviews. Some of them are non-theistic views. Non-theistic views would include humanism, other secular traditions dealing with ethics or morals or meaning or purpose, atheism, and the like. Now, they are in competition with one another. But just as, pardon me, get my notes here. I'm trying to stick to my notes to make it easier for the translators here, so trying not to go off the reservation too often here. The ideological views are, of course, in competition with one another. Both theistic religions and non-theistic philosophies claim to be inspired by science, which is, as I hope I have convinced you, methodologically naturalistic, not philosophically naturalistic. Science per se is not a philosophy of life, although certainly, and this is my own personal case, science can influence or help to develop a particular philosophy of life. The plants are in competition with one another. They are not in competition with the soil. The theist-atheist ideological competition should be viewed as being between competing worldviews. Properly, science can be used to support one or another ideological view, but it cannot be claimed to compel one particular view. Neither religion nor atheism owns science. But there's more. I've added a line below the soil here. Just as soil is underlain by bedrock, which nourishes the soil in various ways, so critical thinking underlies science. But critical thinking also underlies other intellectual pursuits. It is relevant to many intellectual endeavors. These intellectual endeavors variously influence our ideologies, whether theistic or non-theistic. The take-home here is that none of the ideologies own science, and science does not own critical thinking. Thus, I hope, we can encourage everyone, regardless of ideology, to be a critical thinker and to appreciate science. I would like to direct you to the National Center for Science Education's website, where there is a great deal more information about the creationism and evolution controversy. If you go to this button here, you can sign up for a free Friday electronic newsletter, which is prepared by my colleague Glenn Branch. It's excellent. If you go to this button here where it says News, you will be taken to the news page. You can look for international news, or you can sort by year and find out lots of depressing information of what's going on in the country. We also are a membership organization, and we welcome international members as well. We have a YouTube site, and we have a Facebook site where you can find out more about this information. And I also have a Facebook site. Many times when I give public lectures, I receive many requests to be friended. It's interesting how that's become a transitive verb, but nonetheless. If one wishes to get my updates, would you please go to Genie.Scott, because I have, unfortunately, an older website which I don't update, and I have to write you a nice little note saying, please go to this other site. Thank you very much for wanting to be my Facebook friend. Anyway, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in Denkfest. I'm enjoying myself enormously learning all about European skepticism. Thank you. I am told that there is time for questions if anyone has any.
Thanks for your presentation. I do have one critical remark, though, regarding your last point about science being methodologically naturalistic. I think probably that's a valuable point when we're talking politics. So we can say, look, it's not about metaphysical atheism, metaphysical naturalism. It's just our methodology. So stick to the methodology. But I think actually philosophically that's false, because in principle it would be possible to confirm, and it's also possible to falsify metaphysical supernatural hypotheses with the scientific methodology. So suppose prayer studies turned out to, or yielded results that showed that it actually works causally. I mean, that would be one scientific experiment that would actually corroborate a metaphysical, metaphysical, maybe theistic view of the world. So I think actually, in terms of philosophy, it's false to say that science is based on methodological naturalism, because it's just a methodology, and I think as for substance, it leaves open all possibilities. And maybe it's a valuable point politically to say, well, you know, it's just... but I agree with Richard Dawkins or Dan Dennett on this point, that actually evolution corroborates an atheistic view of the world.
Well, you have just expressed an ideological position, which is precisely what I was saying. No, I mean, everybody agrees that science works by explaining phenomena through natural causes. Nobody's arguing about that. The distinction is does science also necessarily entail non-belief? Does science necessarily entail atheism? I believe that it is sloppy philosophy of science to make that claim. It is not merely a political or useful approach to separate science from the ideologies that may be inspired from science. It is not a nuance, it is a real difference. When one says, as the claim has often been made, that you can use science to disprove the supernatural, when you actually look at such attempts, what is required is to bound that entity that you are disproving in ways that are very artificial. And of course, a supernaturalist can always come up with additional characteristics that would disprove or invalidate that particular test. And so it's actually a very pointless enterprise, it seems to me. You cannot hold constant omnipotent forces. I could prove scientifically, observationally, experimentally, that there are not pixies under my bed that appear at midnight. I merely have to go there at midnight and say, look, no pixies. Therefore, I have proved that there are no midnight pixies. However, some could say, oh, but they show up at 1 o'clock. And so it's absurd. It's a ridiculous kind of thing. I think basically one's ideological view, whether atheistic or theistic, is shaped by things like science. But I think that there are a wide variety of other experiences that an individual has that probably have as much or more of an influence upon why one chooses a particular ideology. I'm afraid I cannot agree with you that science entails atheism. The people with microphones are going about. I don't know if they saw you, but keep your hand up.
Hi, quick question. Are we winning, or are the creationists? Is the problem getting better, or is the problem getting worse?
Is the problem getting better or getting worse? It's getting different. If nothing else evolves, creationism does, okay? Currently, the intelligent design people in the United States have been rather quiet. I think they got the stuffings beat out of them pretty bad at Dover. That doesn't mean they've quit. They've merely retooled. And what we are finding in the U.S. is a suite of bills, legislative acts proposed in legislatures, dozens of them in the last few years, that are called academic freedom acts. And it's shifting away from religion, shifting away from former approaches that they've used, and just going right to straight up denigration of evolution. The history of this controversy has been, well, teach evolution, but teach creationism to balance it out. Well, that didn't work. Well, teach evolution, but teach creation science to balance it out, and that didn't work. Well, teach evolution and teach intelligent design to balance it out, and that didn't work. So the current argument is teach evolution, but also teach the weaknesses of evolution. Teach that evolution is just really crummy science, bad science. And let the children decide as a critical thinking exercise. Well, raise your hand if you don't want critical thinking, right? I mean, everybody's for critical thinking. So these are very clever bills. But if you actually look at the content of what they want to teach as weaknesses of evolution, it goes right back to what the intelligent design and creation science people have been promoting for years. So this is just a repackaging of intelligent design. However, coming soon to a nation near you, the bad news here is that, like many things American, good and bad, I know which category I'd put creationism in, we are exporting this and have been for many decades. And we are getting more reports of the strengthening of the anti-evolution movement in Europe as well. In Great Britain, about which I know a little bit more, the major problem seems to be that teachers, although they're not anti-evolution, they just don't know much about the science. There's sort of the assumption, well, of course evolution happened, but what is it exactly? I mean, they don't really know enough about it to teach it well. And this, of course, means that when anti-evolutionists bring materials to class or leaflet students or whatever, the teachers are not in a very good position to counter this misinformation. And so what I'm told, I don't have survey research, but I'm told by colleagues in Great Britain, is that many teachers, as they do in the United States, are just quietly not teaching evolution, which of course means the creationists win, because what they want is for you not to teach evolution. I'd be happy to talk more about this in the break period, because I will be here for the whole meeting. Thank you again.
Thank you.